you noticed the enormous impact industrial change has had on the employment industry? Well, let us tell you a story about it. Around the late 1700s, early 1800s, a revolution, most notably in the manufacturing industry, began, which would go on to affect the rest of the world for many years to come, with the effects of this change still apparent today. We know of this change today as the Industrial Revolution.
One of the most prominent changes as a result of the Industrial Revolution was the introduction of machines and steam power. Factories, workshops and mines began to spring up all over the cities across the UK, were extended and expanded, which ultimately massively increased profits for the owners. Because of the huge influx in the number of factories, workshops and mines, people working in agriculture flocked to cities in seek of the dream and aspirations of a better life and prosperity. But the infrastructure at the time was not suited and could not cope with the huge increase in population. Cities were quite literally built around factories, workshops and mines, which resulted in a very polluted and dirty living environment for most. Manufacturing and mining industries applied the Taylorism approach towards employees. Managers had total and absolute control over their workforce. The workforce was meticulously supervised at all times to ensure every worker adhered to the strict rules, regulations and procedures. Workers' employees were deemed as inferior and were simply mules in achieving productivity. They were treated with utter contempt with no regard for their well-being or welfare. Owners took advantage of this burning desire inside most people to better themselves and prosper and barbarically exploited their labour force. Workers were required to work anywhere between 12 to 24 hours a day, often every day, in appallingly squalid working conditions with limited breaks. However, people began to realise that their dreams of prosperity and a better life were not being realised, and workers began to revolt and oppose the stifling conditions they were forced to work and live in. For instance, Robert Owen, a Welsh social reformer, began publicly supporting and campaigning for the rights of children working in the primary and secondary sectors. He demanded that government and the wider society introduce governance and rules surrounding children in the workplace. This induced labour movements and parties like the Chartism movement, who were primarily focused on with political reform to protect the basic human rights of all employees. This massive public outcry galvanised the then government into making changes and reforms to the legal side of employee welfare. Different laws were created, such as the Factory Act of 1819, where working hours for children were set to a maximum of 12 hours a day. Even to this day, government are continually investing in the rights of workers, such as the health and safety regulations. The introduction of the Minimum Wage Act of 1998 in the UK was the first time in history government set a minimum wage that every employer in the UK had to pay. Numerous acts and laws brought in by government have permanently changed the way businesses operate and treat employees. Wages are now directly related to the role and job performed by the employee. Taylor's approach has now been replaced by Mitzenberg's theory of management. Businesses are much more flexible and accommodating towards employees, and with the huge advancements in technology, workers are now able to work from home or out of office.
Practices then are becoming more generic, but there are also areas where we're seeing 0 hours contracts and things like that, which are much less positive for the individual employee.
Whilst industrial change in employment for the UK may have passed, change in employment in a general sense will continue to evolve and develop for many years to come, and arguably this change and evolution of what is currently deemed acceptable will never end. Consequently, changes in employment, whether to the benefit of employees or employers, will also never cease.
Also, you're going to get more developing economies taking on roles where perhaps manufacturing, lower labour cost types of roles are provided. And in the developed economies, they're going to have to specialise, looking at high-tech products, luxury goods products, and no sort of suggestion that there'll be big growth in manufacturing jobs in the future in those economies.
The biggest change to employment is that workers are no longer dependent on businesses, but rather businesses are now dependent on employees.